Hello to you, dear person reading this story. Make yourself comfortable, grab your best hot chocolate, and let me tell you my story. Know that under my air of a narrator, I'm about to tell you a moment of my life which cannot be erased from my memory. I put a lot of forms in my story to try and forget the fact that I'm about to open up to thousands of strangers on the internet. A very complicated exercise for me. First of all, my presence here comes from the fact that for months, I watched the Let's Not Meet stories, and each time the idea came to me to post here without really having the courage to, probably for fear of being judged, because of the fear that the person concerned might recognize me, or because of the fear that my story just might not be creepy enough. Small disclaimer, the story that will follow happened 3 years ago now. It's possible that my version is slightly altered, even if I try to be as faithful as possible. I blame my bad memory. Also, I'm French, so pardon any mistakes. Now that you have all the basics, let's get right to the story. I'm currently 19 years old, and this story took place when I was 15 in 11th grade. You should know that in life, I'm a very introverted person. Don't have very much self-confidence. I'm very afraid of large crowds and strangers, and I always avoid physical contact. Even my best friends don't do hugs or cheek kisses. For those who don't know, in France, that's how you greet your family or closest friends. At that time, my parents forbade me from using social networks to preserve my innocence. So at the start of high school, I created a Discord account. In my 11th grade, I joined a Discord server full of very nice people. Little by little, I became friends with one of the administrators, and we very quickly became quite close. He told me all about the hardships of having to manage the server. I supported him no matter what, flattered that someone with so much responsibility was interested in a person like me. The months went by, and we got closer and closer. I'd never been happier to have someone paying attention to me. One day, I learned that a school trip was being organized for our class. And guess where we were going? To my friend's town. I told myself that this was a golden opportunity, that I could take advantage of this trip to meet him in person, like my other friends had done with their online friends. I wanted to do the same. I wanted to act like a grown-up. I announced to my friend Baptiste that I would come to his town on a school trip. He was very happy to finally meet me. The weeks went by, and the hour of the trip finally struck. I told Baptiste that I had a visit from his city, but after that I would have 15 minutes of free time which we could see each other for the moment. He told me that suited him just fine. He sent me a picture of his head so that I would be able to recognize him. He also told me that the photo was a bit dated. We exchanged phone numbers as well, because I didn't have internet on mine, and it would be silly if we had no other way of contacting each other to find out where the other was. Level 1. A few hours until the meeting. The day started off well enough. Me, my class, and I take the bus early to be able to reach the city that we're going to visit. The day before, I informed my group of friends that I was going to meet someone from Discord IRL. How happy I was, all those sorts of things. After sharing their concerns with me, they finally told me to just go and enjoy myself. Baptiste also asked me on the way for a photo of me so that he could recognize me when I got there. I was not a big fan of the idea that a stranger had a photo of me. I don't even have any photos of myself because it's something that bothers me a lot. I politely declined his request, explaining that we were in March and it was very warm outside, so I was probably the only person in town wearing a scarf and coat. Our bus finally arrived and parked. We went to go to the meeting point to meet our guide, accompanied by our teachers. We quickly ran across a fun fair. I shared this detail with my beloved Baptiste. In short, we found our guide, and during the explanation of the course of the visit, I received a message. I believe that this moment is when I understood that things were maybe going to take another turn. I opened the message, and what I saw froze my blood. I saw a photo of myself taken from the back, the message saying roughly, "I found you." I can't remember everything verbatim because I changed my phone since then, but I assure you that it was something along those lines. In a reflex, I turned around and noticed that there was no one behind me. Absolutely nobody. I started to have tingles of fear, a rise of anxiety. I sent an answer. Yeah, it's me, but we'll see each other after I visit. At that time, the only thing I could think of was, what the fuck did I just get myself into? We went to the first place to visit for our trip. A few seconds after we stopped, I got another message, another photo of me from behind. Creepy, isn't it? I looked behind me and I still could not see anybody around. My anxiety skyrocketed. I started to shake. My body was screaming at me that I was in danger and begging me to get out of there. We went to the second location. On the way between the first and second place, I saw him on a bench eating an ice cream. As our group passed by him, I took out my phone and sent a message to try and defuse the situation. Hey, I saw you sitting on the bench. Can you wait until we finish the rest of the trip, please? How surprised I was to receive a message immediately. I think you know the rest. When I opened it, it was still a picture of me from my back. At that moment, my friends began to clearly notice that something was wrong. But I didn't actually tell them what it was. I didn't want to ruin the moment we'd have together after, Baptiste and me. Level 2. Can the day get any creepier, please? We then reached the fourth location of our trip. To my surprise, I did not receive a text there. It was actually a real relief. He finally understood that what he was doing was creepy. Let me laugh. Then we come to the fifth place. Still no interaction with him. The idea that maybe it was just a bad start because of weird social interaction comforted me. Maybe he just didn't know how to go about approaching me. Then I turned my head to see with my dismay that Baptiste was embedded in our group, standing just a few meters away from me. Yes, you didn't read that wrong. The guy became encrusted within this group of high school students. Oh, and a little detail that I intentionally left out. In the photo of him that I received, he looked like a 24-year-old. Now think back of taking a picture of a minor who was only 15 and stalking her for 2 hours. We had descended into the depths of creepiness. At the end of the visit to the fifth place, the guide had to leave urgently, but warned us that another guide would come along soon to take over, and we'd have to wait for her in the cathedral square. While waiting, Baptiste sat on a bench a few meters away from me, still enjoying his ice cream while our teachers left us unattended to go buy theirs. Our second guide finally arrived after a while, and we continued on with the tour. During the rest of the visit, this guy followed us everywhere, getting closer and closer to me every time. My friends at that time understood the problem, and tried not to let me die of anguish. At this point, I saw that my history teacher was actually right nearby him, so I sent him another message to dissuade him from continuing to follow me. My teacher is right next to you, you know. You better go, I can tell him. Finally, we reached the last part of the trip. It was a huge relaxation for me because finally I was alone. And by alone, I meant that our dear Baptiste was no longer following us. Finally, it was quiet. Finally, I could just enjoy the surroundings. I felt like I was no longer in danger. Level 3. Our visit was now over. The teachers left us to our free quarter of an hour. However, they forced us to go in groups of 4 and not talk to strangers. You know, the usual stuff. I also received a message from Baptiste at this time, telling me he had been caught by my teachers who had threatened to settle it at the police station. Suddenly, he was waiting at home for me to finish. I decided to switch tactics to the ostrich policy. I didn't answer him at all. With my friends, we decided to revisit certain points that we'd found magnificent without having the impression of dying of fear because of my instinct telling me to steer clear of Baptiste. One of my friends suggested going to a bookshop to look at something, so we all went together. The bookshop formed the corner of 2 streets, and we barely stayed there for 1 minute or so. Then we walked out. I cannot describe to you in words what I felt when I saw Baptiste standing on the corner of the street right across from me. I had this feeling of being paralyzed, having tachycardia, having difficulty breathing, and just not feeling in control. I was officially no longer in control of my body, caught in a state of tetany, of panic. I looked at Baptiste, who was much older than in the photo, since he must have been at least 27. I didn't ask him directly. It wasn't really my priority at this time. My friends, of course, were just as shocked as I was. Baptiste started calling out to me, saying hello, trying to come over to hug me, do the cheek kiss. He then even did it with my girlfriends, and shook the hands of my boyfriends as well. It seemed like in that moment it was just the two of us, me and Baptiste. He approached me and took me under his arm, as if we were a love-love couple, and that we knew each other well. Once again, the physical contact irritated me. He started to take me to I don't know where. And that's when my buddy Jonathan approached me and grabbed me by the waist. Smart move from my friend to make him implicitly understand that I was already in a relationship and that he better not try to get someone else's girl. We're not actually in a relationship, but I'm thankful he tried to help me. I can never thank Jonathan enough, who had the idea of impersonating my boyfriend. He was very aware of my discomfort. As soon as Baptiste saw this, he ceased his physical contact and removed his hand from my waist. Baptiste then suggested that we go to a bar, telling us that he would pay for everything. All we had to do was just enjoy. My friends tried to drill it into him that we were once again only 15 years old, so we would not be touching a single drop of alcohol. Not really knowing how to get out of this situation, we followed him to the bar with the pretext that if the teachers found us there, we were going to get screwed. He therefore suggested going onto the terrace, which we accepted for a lack of an alternative. There begins an extremely embarrassing situation which lasted a long 5 minutes. The four of us, my friends and I, were at one table, with Baptiste sitting at another table with his back to me. We talked like that back to back, him asking me tons of questions, and me answering them in automatic response mode. I also watched my friends a lot as they were giving me clues on what to do. Finally, Jonathan pretended that we had to return to the meeting point given by the teachers. We were getting ready to leave. Baptiste stayed seated and yelled that it was a great time. If he ever came down to my city, we would have to spend time together. I quickly gabbled a response and we got out pretty quickly. Back in my room, I started to cry a lot, shocked at what happened during the day. We went back to our town the next day, then enjoyed 2 weeks' worth of vacation. When the classes resumed, during our English class, the teacher arrived and simply told us this one sentence: "I owe you the truth." At that moment, my friends and I looked at each other in a we know sort of look. The teacher explained that during the entire visit we were followed by a guy, and during the change of the guide, they went a little further to see if Baptiste was going to approach anyone in specific. They wanted to find out who his target was. After a long moment, the teacher told us that they could not find the person in question, and that after, the history teacher had threatened him to leave us alone. After this event, I blocked him everywhere. I don't know really what his intentions were, if it was just some guy who didn't know how to approach girls, or if his intentions were more sinister. I also don't know what would have happened if Jonathan had not grabbed me back from his grip. If I'd been there all alone, I wouldn't have been able to flee. I've suffered heavy after effects from this trauma. The more time passed, the more I became paranoid when I was in the street alone. Would he be waiting for me on the corner? At the corner of every street? This paranoia became more and more omnipresent, to the point that today I've developed an intense sense of anthropophobia. I can no longer leave my house alone without having panic attacks. The presence of unknown people around me causes me respiratory problems, walking trouble, epinephrine shoots in every muscle of my body to escape, dizziness. I think I'm going to a shrink to settle this problem, because I hate having to live as a recluse, barricaded in my room 24 hours a day. This story happened about 2 years ago when I was 19 years old, and my foster sister, Kira, was 16. For the sake of this story, it's important to know that I was female presenting and hadn't come out as trans yet, nor was I presenting myself in an overtly masculine style at the time. It was the summer before I was going to college. I mostly lived with my mom and Kira, except for every other weekend where I'd stay with my dad. Now, summers where I am can get really hot and humid, so we had a habit of waiting to walk the dogs until 6 or 7 p.m., mostly because it'd be cooler but still light enough outside. On this particular evening, Mom wasn't going to be home until very late. I don't remember the exact reason why. She was a woman that liked to stay busy though. often participated in choirs, Bible studies, youth group events, classes, and more. This meant it wasn't uncommon for Kira and I to be left alone until 8 or 9 p.m. It was up to me and Kira to walk the dogs by ourselves, unless we wanted our younger dog Samson to throw tantrums due to pent-up energy. Even though we lived in the countryside and could have walked them down our street, Kira and I decided to drive out 20 minutes to a park instead. Why? I don't really remember. It could have really been anything, from being bored walking our own roads all the time to not wanting to deal with blind curves and hills. Whatever the reason, at around 7:30 p.m., Kira and I harnessed our 2 dogs, packed them up in the car, and drove out to the park. Let me explain the layout of the park so that it's easier to understand why we got nervous halfway through our walk. This park was not particularly big, but it was very popular because of its loop. The entire park was surrounded by a mile-long looping road with attractions like playgrounds, ponds, a small country hall, all spaced about in the inner side of the loop. The outer side was just a bunch of grass, trees, and one shabby playground at its end. Thus, it was common and expected to pass people walking the loop at least 2 times if you were walking in opposite directions, but not if you were walking in the same direction, obviously. Any cars on this road could only drive in one direction because it was a one-way road. At first, everything about the walk was normal. I parked the car safely, we clipped our dogs to leashes, and started on the loop. Every so often, we'd stop so I could take pictures with our good boys, particularly of Kira trying to wrangle Samson. He was always pulling like his life depended on it, and weaving around because he wanted to smell everything. It was while I was taking one of these pictures that our first encounter happened. A man who looked to be in his 40s or so walked past us, walking the same direction we were, up towards the playground on the outer side of the loop. He passed a friendly smile at Kira, nodded, and said, "Hello, cute dogs," or something like that, and kept right on walking. I honestly didn't think anything of it. We were at a park at a time of day where it was common to walk around due to the cooler temperature, and people where I am are generally friendly anyway. Smiling and saying hi is fairly normal no matter who says it. We smiled back, said our own hi's or thanks, depending on what he said, and that would be it. Or so we thought. The man passed us by again only a short 10 minutes later, directly across from where we'd seen him previously. Just like he did before, he smiled and waved and said hi. This time, Kira and I looked at each other once as he was ahead of us, and shared a, "Well, that was weird," expression. Just another 10 minutes later on the dot, he walked past us walking towards the playground and subsequently broke off from the loop. He'd been walking in the same direction as us as well. This time, though, he cut in front of us. He did it in a way where we had to stop to avoid running into him. Hell, he nearly touched Kira with how close he was walking. It was already so weird in and of itself. The other weird part was him cutting past us in the opposite direction. The only way he could have done that was if he'd cut across the inside of the loop, since it would have been close to impossible to pass us at our current point from the other direction if he'd decided to walk the opposite way of the loop than us. It started coming off almost like he was intentionally walking by us over and over again. But just like before, Kira and I brushed this weirdness off. Maybe this guy was just enjoying a random stroll and doing his own weird thing for all we knew. Besides, we had 2 reasonably sized dogs with us. Who'd mess with people like that? Not even 5 minutes later, though, the same man passed us by again, once again cutting so close past us that he nearly brushed shoulders. Again he smiled, and waved before walking off. This was officially the moment I decided we needed to leave. Sure, it was normal to pass a person at least 2 times if you're going in opposite directions, but doing so takes a while. You have to at least get to the parallel spot on the loop from where your paths first intersected to see each other again. I wasn't really a fan of how he was cutting across us. The first time he passed us like a normal person. Every time after, he'd just been walking up around us, behind us, weird directional paths. So yeah, I told Kira to hustle so we could get to our car and get out instead of doing a second loop around. That's exactly what we did. When we were almost to our car, we noticed a car creeping along behind us. We pulled to the side and stopped to let it pass, but for a second it stopped too. We figured this person must be getting ready to park. so we started walking again. The car started creeping along slowly behind us just as soon as we did. We stopped once more, and the car stopped with us. We hadn't seen that middle-aged guy for a while since the third cutoff, so we figured we might have overthought the whole thing. Here we were, though, with this tinted windowed car acting extremely suspicious. Was it the same guy returned with his car? A different creep? We couldn't tell. Before anything could happen, though, another car idled up to the one next to us. Whoever it was sped up to the expected 5 miles per hour. We got to our car pretty fast after that and practically picked up the dogs to get them inside of it. We got in and got out of there. My mistake, however, was neglecting my rear-view mirror and the well-advised rule to not just drive straight home if you're worried a stranger has taken too much interest in you. I was anxious, dumb, and primarily concerned with getting home where we could be safe. Because home is always safe, right? Nothing bad is supposed to happen to you there. My naive sense of false security. I think we got home around 8-something. The sun had finally disappeared behind the horizon, but it wasn't fully dark yet. Just that dusty purple color the sky gets before it finally accepts its nighttime. My mom wasn't quite home yet, so we got the dogs some water, locked the doors, ate a late dinner, and chilled in the living room, talking about a bunch of stuff that really didn't matter. It was almost 9:30 when the scariest part of this whole ordeal occurred. There Kira and I were sitting on different couches, talking about one thing or the other, when we noticed the ceiling briefly light up over where Kira was sitting. An important note here is that Kira was sitting on a small couch with her back to a window that faces the front of the house, while I was on the couch on the opposite wall where I could see a sliver of the front porch. Due to our long, slightly curvy driveway, it was very common to see headlights stream in through the window, light up the ceiling, fade, intensify. It just meant that someone was coming home. So, when that ceiling lit up above Kira, we thought nothing of it, assuming our mom was finally coming back from wherever she'd gone that night. We didn't take any notice of the light skipping the final arc of someone pulling all the way up into the driveway either. We also didn't pay any mind at first to how long it was taking Mom to come inside. After all, she had a habit of pulling in and then checking her phone for God knows how long before coming in. After a couple of minutes, though, I noticed the small motion sensor light Mom had set up on the porch light up. Again, I could only see a very sliver of space based on my position and the curtains. Basically, I could see a smidge of the table and the rails bordering our porch, but not its stairs or anything approaching the door depending on how they moved. I wasn't paying particular attention either, because I assumed it was my mom. Right after the light went off, we both heard the storm door open, but we didn't hear anyone pressing in the code keys of our lock or jiggling the door handle like Mom usually did right away. The moment our storm door creaked open, our 2 dogs jumped up and ran to that door barking like mad. Samson, our dumb goofball son who was incapable of hurting a fly, jumped up on his hind legs and scrabbled to find purchase on one of the small windows in a desperate attempt to see who was outside. Immediately, the storm door slammed shut, and we heard heavy footsteps on the cement of our porch. Calvin started going nuts and jumped up on Kira's couch, standing on its back to look out the window. Samson ran out of the room then and went out the doggy door that led to the back porch, which had a ramp going down to a fenced-off portion of our yard. Suddenly, I felt like I couldn't move. I'd never understood really what people meant when they described their limbs turning to lead until that moment. I felt like I didn't have limbs really, like moving just wasn't an option. If I moved, I might glimpse something or someone through those windows. That person could see me running around the house, freaking out, and decide to come after us after all. So I sat there, my mind steadily going blank as my heart sped up and my limbs refused to move. In the game of fight, flight, or freeze, I found out I'm the freezer. Kira, on the other hand, is a fighter. She spun around and looked out the window. Unfortunately, we couldn't see anything because it was too dark. Naturally, she got up, grabbed a stray dog toy which just so happened to be a tug-of-war rope with a ball on one end, and opened the door. I told her very calmly to shut it and stay inside, but she ignored me and stepped out onto the porch. She came back inside after a moment of not seeing anything, but to my utter disbelief, she disappeared into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and went outside again. This time she was gone for a handful of seconds before running back inside and slamming the door shut. Breathless, she tells me she went out a bit into the yard and saw the outline of a man by the rundown dog kennel we don't use anymore. She saw him and froze when he moved. This time she listened to me when I told her to lock the door. I managed to call my mom despite my head being empty and my limbs being lead. She managed to convince me to get up and make sure all the doors were locked, including the basement, and make sure the dogs were inside. After Mom got home and looked around, finding nothing, we called the non-emergency number for the police, not wanting to bother them in case we were overreacting. They sent 2 officers out who walked around our yard and found nothing. We got the sense they didn't quite believe us, but instead saw us as 2 overexcited girls with exaggerated imaginations. Still, they humored us and told us that after we told them about the park, that if we thought anyone might be following us or if someone was acting a little too creepy, to not drive straight home next time. Then they just left. To this day, I'm pretty sure the only people who believe someone with malicious intent came into our home in hopes of finding 2 teenage girls are Kira and me, though. Whether or not it was the same guy from the park, we can't be sure. But it's too coincidental, isn't it? That day, we had multiple encounters with this guy, went out of his way to get close to us. Then a car inched along behind us, and all of a sudden we have an almost home intruder encounter. There were way too many details adding up for us to have overly excited imaginations. We both saw those headlights, the storm door open and staying open until Samson jumped to look out the door's window. We heard those footsteps, and Kira saw someone. I don't know what would have happened if Calvin didn't have a scary manic bark or if Samson wasn't tall enough to look out the high windows on the door. I don't know much of anything. What I do know is this, though. If you're out and about minding your own business, and a stranger is taking too much notice of you, following you, and frequently running into you, just trust your gut. Don't drive or walk straight home. Meander, get to a public place, and take your time. Pay attention to your surroundings, because you never know who could be watching you. Before I start, I have to explain something. I lived 2 years ago in a house that had a terrace and a small parking lot right below this terrace. My room was upstairs, and there was a door to the stairs that could be locked. I lived in the south of France in the Pont Royal area. Everything was going pretty well. I lived with my former father-in-law and my mother. This particular day, I was playing Minecraft in my room. For no reason, I decided to look to the left towards my window, only to see a man standing there with a balaclava, staring at my window. I see an object in his hand, but I couldn't quite see what it was. Obviously, I got stressed. I went to go warn my mother and my stepfather, totally panicked. They locked all the doors, and it took me a while after to fall asleep and forget about it. Weeks go by after this with no incidents, but about 2 months after the initial stressful moment, I encountered the same situation. This time I was playing Among Us with some friends. I had changed my habits since, though. I had been always looking at the window to see if the guy would be there, and I was always making sure all the doors were locked and closed, too. I see this guy again. Although I'm stressed, this time I was really scared, because this time I was home alone. I left the room for 10 seconds to check something, and suddenly, I couldn't see him anywhere anymore. I told myself maybe he'd finally gone away, but no. I heard a big noise at the front door. I deduced quickly that he was trying to force it open. I was totally stressed out. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and my laptop in a bag. I thought about how to best escape the situation. I opened the window and went down on my terrace. I dropped down to the parking lot. I heard at this moment another noise coming from my house, then a third one. I saw the same guy come out, and I saw the object he was holding was a knife. I started to run until I reached the house of a friend, totally exhausted by my sprint. Fortunately, he opened up to me immediately. I told him with some difficulty what happened to me. In the meantime, I called my mother and the security of the domain. Shortly after, I saw the same car make several turns and pass by 4 times in front of my friend's house. By the second passage of the car, I recognized the man who was there a few moments earlier. in the passenger seat, and I saw not only one person, but 4. 2 years after having lived through this experience, I obviously moved to a bigger city, but moreover to an apartment in a quiet district, and I often have my boyfriend come to see me.
Portis Media.
Good evening all, and welcome. I hope you have your gear and flashlight ready. For tonight, we're going to be venturing on to the night shift. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My story begins, promisingly enough, in an old psychiatric hospital. As I no longer live in the area nor work for the same company, I can even tell you where it is. It's called the Crichton in Dumfries, Scotland. The hospital is made up of a complex of buildings built in the 1870s. Now, you may have a mental image of such a place, but I can assure you, it's nothing like you might imagine. Beautiful buildings set in manicured parklands. It even has an imposing church built at its heart. The signs of its history are there, if you know where to look. The imposing staircase with its beautiful wrought iron guardrails may look pretty, but they're there for a purpose. To stop anyone throwing themselves 40 feet to certain death on the intricately tiled floor below. Hidden rooms that have never seen daylight. The people who work there probably aren't even aware of these hidden rooms, but they're there. As I say, you just need to know where to look. My job was a security guard. Each night I would drive slowly around the complex for an hour at a time. There are plenty of places someone with ill intent could hide, and it's just me. A 5'2" female, armed with only a torch. Prior to me starting, the company had been through 2 guards that hadn't mentioned the fact that they were afraid of the dark, but it never bothered me. It never occurred to me to feel unsafe. Part of my job was to deal with alarm calls. These were usually caused by drafts, moths, flapping curtains, nothing sinister. I would be asked, "Don't you get scared going into those old buildings alone?" Well, no, never. It just didn't occur to me to be scared of things that might go bump in the night. It was one of those beautiful midwinter nights just before Christmas. The frost bit, the moon was so bright that it cast shadows around the buildings. And if I went to the furthest end of the complex, where there were no lights, the stars. I think the stars are what I miss the most. Too much light pollution where I live now. But I remember tilting my head back and seeing the constellations and the faint haze of the Milky Way. I was driving around, minding my own business, when I heard an alarm from one of the buildings. Solway House, to be precise. It's one of the oldest buildings on the complex, and the only one that looks rather dark and foreboding. These days it's used as art studios and practice rooms for budding musicians. It's not unknown for alarms to go off, so I parked up and got the keys out of the back of my van. This would be easy. There was an obvious reason for the alarm. The art class had left the external door wide open. I shut off the alarm and got out my paperwork. As I started to write, I became aware of a loud banging from one of the upper floors. My first thought was that someone was still there. My second thought is that it's 3 o'clock. It's -4 outside, and even in this art studio. Who's gonna break in? An insomniac art critic? Even so, I had to check, So up the stairs I went. I couldn't tell where the banging had come from as it had stopped. I checked each of the rooms, and no one was there, of course. All was deathly quiet. So I went back downstairs to continue with my paperwork. The banging started again, louder. It sounded as if furniture was being thrown around. Could there be a window open? Banging in the wind? Nice try. There wasn't a breath of wind, but you tell yourself these things when you're in an old psychiatric hospital on your own at the true witching hour. Nothing for it. I would have to go up again. There must be something. The banging was loud. It really did sound like furniture being thrown. Once again I went into the art studio, almost expecting the place to be trashed, but everything was in its place. I checked the windows, all locked. I even checked the toilets with their creaky pipes, but there wasn't a sound. I was perplexed. This noise must be coming from somewhere. Now, I'm as partial to a good paranormal yarn as the next person, but when you're attending an alarm activation, you're looking for tangible reasons. Companies will try and wriggle out of paying for call-outs as it is. You try putting under reason for activation, shadow people, or soul-sucking demon from the pits of hell, you could go whistle for your money, that's for sure. It's as I'm going downstairs for the second time that I feel it. My skin prickles with cold, clammy, static energy. I could swear that there's something behind me. Not someone, something. Something that doesn't want me there. Don't let it know you're there. Don't let it know you're scared. That was exactly what I was thinking. I can't explain, except I know I have felt this before. Many years ago, as I gladly moved out of a house whose negative vibe had drained my life of color. It's a feeling, like a mass of negative energy. That's all this is. That time before, it had felt malevolent. I know that sounds dramatic, but it's the only way I can describe the pure fear I felt. And so I descended the stairs, the feeling keeping pace with me. There's only one thing for it. Saint Michael, the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our defense against the wickedness and snares of the devil, I prayed. I'm not a Catholic, but when the chips are down and the prayers to Saint Michael the Archangel can be pretty effective. It's also good when I get sleep paralysis, but that's another story. On the final turn of the stairs, the creeping feeling stopped, just like that. I'd like to say I ran out into the night like a big girly, but I had paperwork to finish. As I did, the banging started again. The sound of furniture crashing to the ground. I finished my paperwork, went to the bottom of the stairs, and shouted, "I haven't got all night for your nonsense. I'm going now, so you can knock yourself out." And that was it. I left. Later on, back in the office, I said to one of my colleagues, "Weird thing. I was at an alarm at Solway House." He stopped me. "Ghosts? Oh, aye. Solway House is haunted as. That's where they used to cremate the bodies where patients died." So there you have it. I will say one thing for the ghosts of Solway House. At least they have taste. At least they're haunting a rather beautiful, if foreboding, building. We also had a ghost in our office. Our uninspiring 1950s concrete box of an office. A ghost with no ambition. A ghost that was basically phoning it in. I prefer my ghosts with a bit of class. The sort that choose frost-bitten moonlit nights to make themselves known. I'm sure they will still be there, long after I'm gone. I work the night shift at an alarm company and monitor alarms, residential and commercial, all throughout the night. I work completely by myself. and it's a rather small office with about 6 to 7 rooms, including the front desk and a conference room. So it's like every other night. I go in and out of my office during the night to use the restroom or fill up my water bottle. Nothing was out of the ordinary. A few hours later, I go out to the restroom and notice the light in the front desk area was on. It certainly was not on the last few times I went there, and I would have seen it. I'm not one to scare easily at all, but that was weird. I went in, turned the light switch off, and went about my night not thinking twice about it. From inside my office, I monitor cameras to the office, so I would have seen anyone if they were there. A few minutes later, I get a phone call, which is kind of unusual at that particular time, but I answered, and no one spoke. I heard something, slight movements I guess, enough to know there was someone on the other end. I said hello a few times, and I took the number of who's calling, and it said Conference 1. The conference room was a few feet away from me. I hang up immediately. I look at the Conference 1 camera, and there's nothing. It's all clear. The phone is where it's been all night, and I go out to the conference room to be met with nothing. All is quiet, all is clear, and I was a little shook by this. But again, if I don't see it, I won't let it get to me. I shrugged it off and tried not to think about it too much. Fortunately, nothing happened for the rest of my shift. I work the night shift at a motel in a fairly small city in Oklahoma. We have a Walmart and a small college about 10 minutes away, so it's not tiny or anything. It's small enough that there's usually no reason to be creeped out about anyone you encounter here. So here I am, getting my laptop situated for the next 8 boring hours, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. And this 60 to 65-year-old lanky guy comes in, and he says he's the new employee and that I'm supposed to train him tonight. I remember that I was training someone and mostly just think, shit, now I can't binge watch Buffy like I'd planned. He comes around to the desk and I start giving him the basic rundown of the job. Do literally nothing besides check people in and print some papers out for the night audit team later in the night. He comes off as generally nice, could hold a conversation, but kind of slow, almost slow enough to call him dumb. But I just assumed he's the type of person that needs to do things a few times before getting the hang of it. I should mention that he had worked another shift previously, and my co-worker said he wasn't the smartest person in the world, but figured he'd work it out in the long run. After a while of bullshitting, joking around and watching Modern Family, and just getting to know each other, he asks if I'm married or not, to which I say no. He tells me he recently got a divorce, and it pretty much destroyed his life, hence the motel job. Around 2:30, he tells me he forgot his heart medication, and asks if he can run home to get it, about a 5 to 10 minute drive away. I told him that it wouldn't be a problem, and I figured since he was old and staying up until 7 in the morning, he might actually need that medication. Around 3 a.m, he comes back, and immediately looks different. One of his eyes just won't open. He's squinting with his eye the entire time, and trying very hard to open it. The first thing he asks was, "You got any rooms?" I think he's joking, so I try to laugh off his extremely unfunny joke. He comes around and sits next to me, and we decide to watch another episode of Modern Family. Shortly into the episode, he starts talking about sex and asking me weird questions like, "Do you have sex regularly?" At this point, I should give you a little description of myself. I'm a 23-year-old ginger, chubby, gay guy. I'm pretty much one of the least attractive people you could ask for. Needless to say, I wasn't expecting what came next. "With whom do you have sex?" he asked. My usual rule when someone asks me about my sexuality is to just be honest. But it being Hicktown and all, and trying to be discreet, I say, with friends. He then asked if I were gay, but I said no. He kept going on about sex, and then tells me he likes guys. To which I reply, and still with no red flags popping up in my head, "Oh, hey, me too." At this point, he's noticeably acting strange. Textbook drunk behavior, like slouching, and just freezing in that position for an extended period of time, losing focus, and looking like he just needs to take a nap. Again, no red flags pop up because I think he's just having some sort of reaction to his medicine. I ask him if he's okay, and he says that he's not feeling well, and that he is indeed having a strange reaction to the medicine. I ask him if I should ask my managers to come pick him up, but he refuses. That's when I realize this shit's not right. But still, I want to just get through the shift, and we can get help in the morning. A few minutes later, I look over and he makes eye contact with me, and gives me a little nod as if to say, "Come here." I look back at my computer, and when I turn my head, he's just a little closer, and reaches his hand out, and then literally asks, "You wanna?" I'm just like, "No, sorry, I can't do that at work." He shuts up for a second, and then asks, "Why don't you?" I perk up. "What?" "You could flash me your ass or something." I'm still not fully recognizing here that this needs to stop, and I just flat out tell him, "No, you're clearly screwed on something. Let's just make it through the night, and we'll figure this out in the morning." He responds by rolling his chair over and touches my friggin' thigh. I pull away with a little laugh and say something like, "Look man, I don't want to call the manager, but I will. Stop." He looks a little shaken up and rolls back over, and about a minute later he does it again. Only this time, it was like he was trying to be sneaky about it. I stand up and tell him that I have to pee. In truth, I went to the back storage area, locked the door and called my manager, and told him the situation. Obviously, he says something to the effect of, "Oh shit, call the police." I'm not a physical specimen by any means, but I wasn't physically intimidated him by one bit. I think that's what made me so lax about it. So I called the police and they said they'd be right over, although they sounded super confused. I made my way back out to the desk to check on him, and he's gone. I looked everywhere on the first floor, but he was nowhere to be found. Then I looked outside the glass door. In the dark, I couldn't tell who it was, but someone was on all fours in the parking lot. I walked out to find him weeping and holding his broken glasses, and there was a huge blood spatter right in front of him. I don't know exactly how it happened, but I assumed he simply slipped or passed out and fell flat on his face on the concrete. His face was all bloodied up, and he clearly couldn't function. So I helped him up, walked him to the couch in the lobby, cleaned him off with a wet rag, and sat him down. He kept asking me for a room, but after a few times I said, "Sure, I'll get you a room in a few minutes." The cops showed up about 5 minutes later, questioned him and took him to jail for the night. They didn't tell me much, But from what I could gather, they had apparently had to deal with this guy multiple times, and he clearly had some issues. And then it was over. I told all of my friends, family, and co-workers the next day, and they all seemed really sketched out. But to me, it was just some creepy old gay dude. He lived in denial for so long that something snapped, and he didn't know how to live with himself. I never felt threatened during the night. It was just a profoundly weird experience. Of course, had I been a girl or smaller guy, I might have freaked out a little bit harder. I work as a nurse in a home for the elderly. I've been doing this job for about 12 years now, and over time, death becomes something normal. As hard as it sounds, I'm kind of used to it. It's not nice, but it's part of the job, and I've never felt scared or uncomfortable to be around a dead body. After 6 years, I was tired of working in the casualty unit of the local hospital, and changed over to my current position of night shift, and the darkness isn't a problem for me either. But that changed. Last summer, one of the residents died. I never liked that man. He was a drunk and quite abusive against his wife, who was also a former resident there. When he moved in, he even had a dog, and often refused to feed the poor thing and kicked it until we took it away from him. To be honest, I was glad he was gone. At the time, I worked with someone who was a pain in the neck sometimes, and I faked to be really busy during the night, but was actually watching YouTube on a different floor. The whole time I had that eerie feeling that someone was behind me, but I thought it was just me, until I heard a loud noise in the hallway behind me. I turned around and saw one of the big laundry carts lying on the floor, with one of the little wheels still spinning. These things are quite heavy, and normally they can't just flip around, but some kind of extrusion kicked in, and I never really thought about it. I just picked up the cart and moved on with my shift, but I had enough of being alone and joined my co-worker. Nothing else happened that night. The next day, another co-worker of mine, who was my best friend, began acting strange. Everyone was quite nervous and clingy. Most people at my workspace don't like me that much, and some even ignore me. But somehow we spent some nice time together this evening, and they looked like they didn't want to be alone for some reason. Eventually, we managed to get the evening shift out of the house, and my friend Maria and I prepared some nice coffee and a good talk. It began slowly, with some quiet noises, like someone was knocking on a wall or door. At first, we ignored it because it soon became so frequent, we had to investigate the noise. We walked around the whole building, but it seemed like the noise was switching around. We heard it in a room on the first floor, but while we approached it, it suddenly seemed to be on the second floor and so on. At this stage, we joked about rats in the walls, trying to calm us down, but we both knew this wasn't a normal night. While on our little hiking tour, one of the residents approached us, complaining about the little man in his room. This was a common thing in a home. We have a lot of people with dementia, and they wander around sometimes, but we both knew the usual suspects were sleeping. As you can guess, the room was empty. The man had a nightmare, and that's it. But over the next hours, people called us because of a little man in their rooms. We got really scared. We even grabbed a kitchen knife and carried it around for safety. And at 1 a.m. the noise changed. We heard footsteps quite clearly, and Marie freaked out a bit. Even now I refused to accept something paranormal was going on, and approached the noise, but I think this made it even worse. The steps became louder and more pronounced until they stopped, only to start somewhere else. It sounded violent in some way, like someone rushes at you in anger. We heard more and more noises, loud banging, steps, and even doors opening. We even found doors open we definitely closed, and lights turned on that were off when we left the room. We were pretty close to call the police a few times, but who would believe a story like this? Somehow we got our shift done, and we told everything we experienced during the night shift to the morning shift. Strangely, no one laughed at us. It turned out they had experienced the same thing the day before. Marie and I drove home, and after a nap, she called our boss. At the time Marie called, the entire morning shift refused to work. They'd heard the noise too, and most horrified, they washed one of the residents shortly after and found a foot-shaped mark on her chest, like someone had stepped on it with force. Marie and our boss then called a mental healer who works at the hospital unpaid once a week. He claims to talk with spirits, and the residents can call him up if they want to, and something spiritual, like the fear of death or the afterlife or something. He and Marie went to the dead man's room and stayed there for about an hour. She never told me what they did, but in some way, whatever it was helped. The next day, we had a normal shift, and since then nothing happened. I don't think about this night very often, but since then 2 other people have died in my shift. I'm not scared about it, and I can do my best as usual. But from time to time, I just stop and think for a moment, and hope it never happens to me again. About 6 years ago, when I was still in high school and living in my parents' house, I had begun having some very odd experiences. I'm going on record stating I have always believed in the paranormal. It's my belief that there are things out there that we can't explain, and that we need to be careful of. I used to hear demonic voices besides the head of my bed every morning at 4 to 5 a.m. At first I thought it was the radio. That's when I realized it couldn't be, because I hadn't slept with my radio on since I was 12. I woke up every morning to confirm that my radio was in fact turned off. That same year, around the same time all of this was happening, I was in the bathroom getting ready to take a shower. The only thing running was the water in the shower, and the door to the shower was closed. The door to the bathroom was closed. The vents were off and not heating nor cooling the house, so no air was coming out. The one tiny bathroom window was closed, but somehow a brand new, untouched, just put on the roller toilet paper roll somehow unwound itself on the floor, but not like a little bit, but half the roll had managed to unwind itself. Also, while growing up, I'd be lying in bed and feel like there was something tugging my blankets off. I had vivid memories of clutching onto my blankets and feel something on the other end giving me some sort of tug of war. As well as when I was very young, I would feel things on the top of my bed, so I would flail my legs, and once in a while I would make contact with something pushing it off my bed. This could have just been my cats, as I grew up with a few of them, although sometimes my door to my room would be closed and none of them would be able to enter. Finally, I used to work security at a hospital. I swear to God, one night I got called in for the night shift. As I was approached by a member of the cleaning staff, something seemed off. We spoke for a bit, and they brought up ghosts, asking if I believed in them. It was around 2 to 3 in the morning, and the cleaner even mentioned that ghost activity tends to peak around these hours. However, maybe about an hour or two after, I was walking around and bumped into a different cleaner, and when I asked her what happened to the other person who had been cleaning in the section of the hospital I was just in, I was told that there hadn't been another cleaner, just the dude that I was speaking to at that very moment. About 2 years ago, when I had first moved to the front desk after working in laundry, a rather strange man moved into our hotel. His name was Simon. He had recently gone through a divorce and had nowhere to live. He was one of those guests, you know the kind, that has to talk to you about everything and tells you their life story at the drop of a hat. Now, during my second shift working alone, he checked in. Or should I say he wanted to move in his stuff, but not himself, for a discounted rate. He already had worked out a really cheap rate with the director of sales, and Simon still wanted a discounted rate on top of that for putting his stuff in the room. He's still using the room, so it still counts as rented, but you know guests don't see it that way. I got permission from our director of sales to give him a discount, and he started moving in his stuff. He needed help with everything, and I was the only staff member on property, so of course I had to help him. He thanked me for my help, but instead of giving me a tip or anything, he gives me a flashlight with his failed business name on it. Great, thank you so much, Simon. Now back then I used to only work first shift, so I'd always see Simon downstairs for breakfast. He told me all about himself, including about his heart. There was something wrong with it. One day the second shift even had to call an ambulance for him. He had a heart attack. He came back and seemed fine. I kept seeing him drinking and smoking and such. I warned him gently that he shouldn't be doing that. He seemed to think it would be fine though. I frowned and hoped he'd be okay. He told me they had messed up the surgery on his heart, and the next day he'd be going back to the hospital for surgery again. He told me about how he was suing the hospital, and I wished him luck, and he went back to his room. The next morning I didn't see Simon come down for breakfast. I didn't think much of it at the time, but then someone came in asking for him. The really strange thing was that there was another man at the hotel at the time with the exact same name. He was in the room right across the hall from the other Simon, so I called him first and told him his friend was looking for him. He had no idea what I was talking about, so I called the other Simon, but there was no answer. Simon's friend told me he hadn't been able to get a hold of him since yesterday afternoon, and he needed to get to the hospital for his surgery. He wanted a key to his room. I couldn't give him one, since his name wasn't on the reservation. I told him to wait in the lobby while I went to check on him. I felt very nervous all of a sudden. I went up to his room and started knocking and calling his name. To no answer. I tried to open the door, but the latch was on. I went and got the maintenance man to help me break open the door. When we got the door open, the maintenance man was too nervous to go into the room, so I went in, calling his name with increasing panic. He was lying on his bed, not moving. I started calling his name again, but there was still no answer. I felt so scared then that I called 911, and they told me to check to see if he was still breathing. He was not. But one quick touch told me everything I needed to know. He was cold as ice. Simon was dead. It was really terrifying to me at the time, but I tried to keep calm. The doctors arrived, and tried to revive him. But of course, it was far too late for that. Instead, they called a body bag. Simon's friend called his family to let them know. Simon's brother came by later that day to clean up his room, and housekeeping cleaned up later on, and found some really strange things in his room, such as voodoo dolls. He was a really strange guy. Since then, I've always tried to rent out that room last. It's kind of spooky to go in there. The lights always seem to flicker, despite maintenance checking on them several times. Perhaps I'm just being superstitious, but it's freaky. To this day, it's one of the worst things that's ever happened while I've been working here. When I was little, my stepdad used to work the night shift at a gas station on the outskirts of Reno, Nevada. It's a nice part of town off the highway before you head up to the Sierra Nevadas and Lake Tahoe. The area back then was fairly new, and the Shell gas station was really nice. My stepdad never had any problems working the night shift, though he did tell me some interesting characters would come in, and he would often have regulars that he'd become friends with. My stepdad was the only one in the shop when he worked the night shift, and he was always told about the ghosts that like to pester the other workers, like turn off the lights, open or close the bathroom doors, knock snacks off the shelves and the like. My stepdad, being the massive skeptic as he is, didn't believe any of these stories, and because nothing ever happened to him, he just brushed them off. Until one night, my stepdad is working on the night shift, and it's a pretty quiet night. He hasn't had many customers coming through other than for gas, and since it's a pay at the pump station, hardly anyone comes into the store. So my stepdad is playing on his phone and frequently glances up at the doors or at the security monitors to see if anyone was coming, but the station was deserted. He turns his attention back to his game when he hears the electronic sliding doors open and the sound of the bell above the door goes off. My stepdad puts down his phone and looks up to greet the customer, but he doesn't see anyone. He calls out to no answer. He glances at the security camera, but doesn't see anyone else in the shop except for him, and there are no cars at the station or the parking lot. He gets a little weirded out since the doors have sensors, and the only time they're open is if they sense someone approaching them. But he just talks it up to a prank or some sort of malfunction and resumes his name. Hello? He hears the voice as clear as day in front of him. His head immediately snaps up to speak to the customer he clearly did not see before, but there's no one there. He's even more weirded out, but convinces himself he was either imagining things or that the sound somehow came from his phone or the radio. And then he hears the screams. He said the sound of the women screaming just came out of nowhere, and they were so loud and so chilling, he jumped and dropped his phone. My stepdad is a pretty big guy, 6'2" and a little hefty, and he doesn't normally get scared over anything. But he said the screaming terrified him so much, he couldn't really think straight. He ran out from behind the counter and checked the aisles, but no one was there. He checked the bathrooms and maintenance closet, and no one was there either. But the screams were still going, and they were deafeningly loud. So he thinks maybe there was a woman outside who was being hurt or attacked. He runs out to where he thinks the woman is screaming. There's no one there. The lot is empty. There are no people, no cars, nothing. He checks around the back of the store and does a loop. but he can't find the source of the screaming. And just as suddenly as the screaming had started, it stopped. He goes back inside and checks the security tapes to see if he's missing anything. But other than him running inside and outside of the store like an idiot, he didn't see anything else, and he's unsure of what to think. The next day, as he's leaving work and his co-worker takes over, he tells them about what happened, brushing it off as just some weird prank some little shit pulled. But the co-worker's response was very different, and even though my stepdad doesn't believe in any sort of paranormal activity, the words stuck with him. "Oh, so you've heard her too?" This story takes place about 2 years ago. I was working graveyard in a small town casino in the cafe on Halloween night. I was dressed up as Hermione because I'm a huge Harry Potter fan and my work has a Halloween contest, so I thought I would put myself out there, which I never do, and get in on the fun. Now, my outfit consisted of a short skirt with leggings and a polo shirt and a tie, all Gryffindor themed. So I'm the cashier and it's about 2 a.m. We don't usually have many customers at this time, but since it's Halloween we were busier than normal. So I'm just checking people out and doing my job and actually having a good time, seeing everyone dressed up. When this guy comes to the counter, I can tell immediately that he's drunk. He was super tall, at least 6 foot, and really buff and bald. I remember his total was like 240. I don't know why I remember that, but I do. All he had was a $100 bill, and I had to tell my manager to get change. He looks at me and goes, "No, this is for you. I'll pay for the coffee separately." Now, as a cashier, we hardly ever get tips, but if someone wants to tip you, they can. But no one has ever tipped me this much before. So I was like, as I wasn't sure if he was serious. He then looks me up and down and says, "It's for you to come to my room with me." I immediately handed back the $100 bill and said, "No thank you." He takes out another $100 bill and throws them both at me and goes, "How about now?" "No, thank you," again. Luckily, security were close by and saw what was going on. He came over and nicely asked the guy to pay for his coffee and leave. The guy looks at the security guard and says, "If she's gonna dress like a horse, she should act like one." At this point, I'm close to tears. I've had my fair share of creepy guys in my life, but never like this. Never in my face. The security guy tells him to pay for his coffee and leave immediately, or he will be escorted out. The guy looks at me and says, "Okay, bitch. I'll wait for you outside. You better meet me there, or else." I'm just standing there not really sure what to say or do, because this guy was very intimidating. The security guy tells him that is a threat and calls the cops. The guy goes crazy and tries to hit the security guard, but he missed, and the guy puts him by the wall and radios over for someone else to call the cops. So the creep keeps looking over at me and saying, "Why do all whores act like this? At least I would have paid you," as well as other obscene things. This all happened so quickly and escalated at such a rate that I barely had time to think. At this point I'm crying, and my co-workers take me to the back. The cops came and arrest the guy. I guess he had punched a hole through the wall and tried to hit one of the cops. The cops took my statement and I was allowed to leave early, and the same security guy walked me to my car. Now, the messed up thing is apparently that this guy was a huge spender at the casino, and the casino didn't even press charges or 86'd him or anything. I quit soon after. For several weeks last year, I was asked to cover and supervise a warehouse team on an evening shift, working until midnight. One of my duties was to check the whole warehouse at the end of the shift for security, as well as health and safety reasons, ensuring everything was good for morning shift who started at 7 a.m. I'm not really one for measurements and can't tell you the exact size of your warehouse, but think of a large supermarket over 3 floors, and that gives you a pretty good indication over how big it is. One night, I was running late in the warehouse alone. It was 1:45 in the morning. The top floor was laid out in long, narrow picking aisles, much like a supermarket, with a small packing area where I was stood collecting paperwork. All of the aisles were in complete darkness, as the lights were powered by movement. The only lit area was the packing bench where I stood. I was standing a square off one of the aisles and could see down to the very far end of the top floor where I was. I just finished my paperwork when I heard a click, and the lights at the very far end of the aisle come on. I knew there was a person at the end as it illuminated the door and wall. I looked quite surprised. I knew there wasn't anyone else there, because they'd all gone 45 minutes before. I'd watched them leave. I checked, and the lights came back on. By this point I'm starting to crap myself, as one by one of the aisles begins to light up section by section, as if something or someone were walking directly past me. The hairs on the back of my neck stuck up, and I was frozen as the whole aisle clicked and lit up, until it eventually reached the end of the aisle, just feet away from where I was standing. It's safe to say, I never stayed in that late motel in the warehouse on my own again, and it did freak me out. I work at a Jimmy John's in the worst part of my town. I mainly work closing shifts, which are the ones with very, very little business. It also means that the only people in the store are our driver, my manager, and me. This took place a few months ago. Since it was the beginning of the school year, we had several people quit so they could make it to classes. So we had a lot of openings. One night as we were getting ready to leave, a man walked in. He immediately put my spidey senses in overdrive, not only since he was wearing dirty clothes, but also because he was shaking really badly. Like it was 30 degrees outside. Oh, and he was also wheeling in his bike in one hand, and in the other, holding open a carton of buttermilk. The conversation went as follows. "Hey man, what can I do for you?" "Hey, I filled out an application a while ago, and I never heard back. Just wanted to check on that." "Oh sure, let me ask my manager." By this time, my manager, who was just around the corner, had actually heard the conversation through the headset. This guy's no good. He told me in the interview he didn't have a house or car. Plus, look at his arms. I stole a glance at his arms, where I saw at least a dozen drag marks, which are basically left from doing heroin. Just bullshit something to get him out. I turned around and told him some garbage about how the position was already filled. He obviously looked annoyed at this, and before he whipped his bike around to leave, he flipped me off. I told him to enjoy his night too, and looked down at the monitor to look busy. That's when it happened. As he left, he reeled back and slammed his buttermilk against the door, covering the glass and floor beneath. After he was gone, I was asked to clean it up. Then after we closed, I saw a dude on a bike that looked like he was watching from across the street. We called the police and dipped out of there, but nothing ever came of it. I guess he just wanted to freak us out. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's video. Just a quick announcement, YouTube have released new information regarding the bell icon and how many people are pressing it, and how effective the non-bell icon is. Basically, if you enjoyed tonight's video, why not subscribe if you haven't and press the bell icon to be notified every time I post, which would be a pretty amazing thing.